The Chalke History Festival special series on history with Jackson. So hello everyone, welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast as we welcome back Kate Vigurs, author, historian and friend, to talk about a brand new book, Mission Europe, The Secret History of the Women of SOE. How you doing, Kate?
I'm good, thank you. There it is. Yeah, all good, thank you.
I loved reading this book, and the cover is incredible. It ties really nicely in with your last one as well. It's a great thing to discuss as well.
It's just a fantastic cover, isn't it? I absolutely love it. When the email comes in and they say, here's your book cover reveal, you're like, what's it going to be? And I opened it and just went, this is everything. You know exactly what to expect from this book, from that cover. And like you say, it ties in really beautifully with Mission France as well.
And I think that's a really nice time as well to ask you, a bit of a cliche question, but what inspired you to write this book?
I realised when writing Mission France that France is covered a lot, let's be honest. And whenever people say resistance or when they mention Special Operations Executive, I would hazard the mind will rush to France first because it's the best documented, TV, everything. And I was like, so there's a footnote in my PhD which says, and some women served in other places too. That was literally it. And I thought, come on, we can do better than that. They deserve to be more than a footnote. And as I got thinking about it, I realized there was a lot to be told about the other countries. Now, you only get 2 or 3 agents in each of these countries. So it's a very different pace. And I would say probably go into a lot more detail. But these women deserve the recognition too. They made the same decisions. They risked the same things. So I want them to be household names as well.
And I think it's really nice how you're able to decentralize that narrative away from France, because as you said, so much of this conflict is centered, and the history of this conflict is centered around what goes off in France. But I think before we go into this conversation and touch more upon what happened during the war, I think there's a few things we need to kind of define and contextualize. So, what is the SOE and how is it organized? And you also mentioned a couple of other organizations as well that link to it, the FANI and MI9 and SIS as well.
So let's start with Special Operations Executive because it's in the title. SOE was started in July of 1940. I get really irritated when people say they're Churchill's secret army because he rubber stamped it, but let's not lie, there were a few other people involved. But yeah, their mission was sabotage and subversion to set Europe ablaze. Quite literally, this is blowing things up, shooting things down. This is slowing down the German war effort as much as possible. So that's what they're there to do. They're there to bolster the local resistance, to help them, to train them, and just to slow things down as much as possible in terms of the German war effort. So blowing up factories, blowing up railway lines, that kind of thing. They only employ men to start off with. The first female recruit isn't until April 1942, and that is F section. You do have a few people working, or women working unofficially for SOE. But by 1942, it's not a case of realizing women can do the same as the men. I don't think that was ever the problem. It was more they're not protected by the Geneva Convention. Men were subject to be rounded up by the forced labour programme, this Service du Travail Obligatoire. Sorry to any French speakers. But the idea is like rounding men up of military age to go and help the German war effort. So it's easier, and I hate the bunny ears quotations, but it's easier for women to move around occupied territory. So that's SOE. That's what they do. And they help prepare for D-Day. SIS, Secret Intelligence Service, also MI6, they are spies. SOE, I would argue, are secret agents. SIS are spies. They are spying, gathering intelligence. So while they're over there saying, keep everything quiet, fellas, SOE are over the other side blowing everything up. So you can imagine and understand why there's a tension. Also, SIS had been around since before the First World War, and SOE just like, hi everyone, we're here. It's July 1940 and we're off. So there is tension. I also mentioned the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, the FANI. They've been around since before the First World War as well. The most highly decorated auxiliary unit of the First World War. Come the Second World War, they're kind of in 2 parts. There's the Women's Transport Service, so ambulance drivers and so on. But you've also got SOE Fanny. So agents going into training, going undercover, are employed by Fanny. So they've got a rank, they've got a uniform, they've got a salary. Also, they've got a cover when they're off training. So they can tell their families they're going to be ambulance drivers, etc. But you've also got around 3,000 Fanny working as admin. We talk about wireless operators in France. Who's listening? It's the women in the UK. Who's packing the parachutes? Who's doing the admin? Who's running the offices? It's the women of the Fanny. That organisation still exists. It's a Princess Royal Volunteer Corps. And I think the last one you mentioned was MI9, so MI Military Intelligence, 9 Escape and Evasion. So they are basically working the escape lines across the Pyrenees, across the mountains, trying to facilitate downed Allied airmen or prisoners of war or prisoners of interest, persons of interest who need to get out of occupied territory. And amongst that, you could count Jews who are being terribly persecuted. Just get them out of the country, get them out of harm's way. So MI9 are the overarching organisation for that.
And,
That was
I'm
long
sorry to have
answer,
had to have
sorry.
asked. I'm sorry to have asked, how many, about the different organizations, because it's so many organizations to get your head around and begin to
Yeah.
understand what's going on in the conflict and what role women are playing within them. But you mentioned something really interesting there, that these women who are serving in the SOE, some of them are serving in an unofficial capacity
Mm.
before 42. So what are they doing in that period between the beginning of the war and when the SOE start officially recruiting?
So this kind of goes back to Virginia Hall, who went out. She was American, and because of that, she was neutral. She went out to the unoccupied zone, to Vichy, France. Her cover was as a stringer for the New York Post, but she's really there to work out who's resistance, who isn't, who can they trust, to build up safe houses so incoming agents have places to go. They've got a point of contact. They've got a way of getting money and getting support. And then you've also got Christina Scarbeck or Christine Granville doing similar work. And they're kind of in there before SOE. There is no official discussion. I can't find anything that says, any document that says, and then we decided to recruit women. It all seems to be quite organic. But then obviously you've got women working in the resistance as well. You've got people just in occupied territory who might be approached by somebody else who's in the resistance. Thinking of Trix Terwint in the new book. She's approached by a former colleague. He's become a member of the resistance. He asks her to help out a little bit, and then she helps out a little bit more. And then before she knows it, she's helping somebody across to England. And then the English say, well, hey, do you fancy being an SOE agent and going back? So there are lots of stories like that where people are in the resistance, they're making contact with SOE, sort of bumping up against it almost. And then because they've come to England or because they're recruited locally, they become what we would term an SOE agent, and that they receive SOE training. That gets convoluted though, because you can get SOE training and not be an SOE agent, like Elżbieta Zawadzka, for example, in Poland. She gets SOE training, but her mission isn't SOE. Trix's mission was never going to be SOE either. It was always going to be an MI9 mission. So we would infiltrate her, see her safe for 24 hours, and then she would start work for MI9.
I find that I found that quite interesting, actually, the parallel nature of resistance, women in resistance, and then working for the SOE as well. Did it differ by the different countries? Because obviously it's not just France, as you mentioned. There's Poland, there's the Netherlands, there's Belgium. Does that recruitment process change through different nations?
Yes, it is different because you've got different heads of sections, so you've got different ideas about use of women. I think it's Belgium where Elaine Madden, I know she goes into Belgium, I'm trying to remember, it's her story, where she has to wait until she's a certain age. And then with the Netherlands as well, are we going to use women? Aren't we going to use women? And then there are memos backwards and forwards about the use of women, and these women are trained and they're ready to go, but they kind of faff about a bit before they use them. So yeah, it does differ by country, which is why I think we see so few. fewer women going into the likes of the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark than you get into France. France is different anyway, I think, because of proximity to Britain, Britain wanting to be in control of the government after the war, so trying to influence it during the war. So there does seem to be very different ways of recruiting the women and ways of using the women once they are in the field as well.
And I think that leads really nicely onto my next question is that, when you're talking about the different, natures of occupation, the different governments that are in place throughout, you know, what kind of roles are they taking on? Because, you have a lot of men who are running these who have different opinions on how these women should be involved, when they should be involved. What different roles are they taking?
So let's take the opening chapters. And I know there's a fantastic biography of this lady already out, but you're going to get more agents though from me. If we look at Elżbieta Sabaska, for example, she was working alongside resistance in Poland, which was very, very organized and very, very structured, like an army structure almost. And she was an instructor helping women prepare if war should come again. And then during the September campaign, she's very, very active with the resistance and kind of fighting back. But then her role develops as she becomes a courier. So she's taking messages to various different countries. And I was so lucky when I was in the archives, I got to hold the key where the microfilms were hidden, which she just took across with her. So yeah, she travels right across Europe really, and then she's given a mission to go to England, and it's a dual mission. And one of the parts of the mission is to gain recognition for women, to get them to have their rank recognized, because they might be more qualified than some of the men they're working with, but they're never allowed a superior rank. So she has this twofold mission to get a report to the Polish government in exile and to get this letter to General Sikorski, who says, yes, yes, I'll deal with it in due course, and then never came back, unfortunately. But she did get this report done. So they're doing all sorts of different roles. In the Netherlands, it's courier work. And I also talk about the women of the Palmach who were recruited in Mandate Palestine. Their missions are completely different. Their missions are to help the Jews of Europe. And if you look at someone like Hannah Senesh, her mission is to try and stop the transportation of Jews from Hungary, which in Holocaust history is the biggest, most horrific, and quickest deportation of the lot. There's even a new ramp built at Auschwitz waiting for them. And her mission, along with a handful of other people, is to try and stop that from happening. So many different missions.
And you can just to hear you talking how instrumental some of these women were in the Allied war effort, and I will never ever complain about hearing more about Zoe as well. I absolutely love
Oh,
listening
she's
to
great, isn't
Zoe's
she?
story. It's just fantastic. But then you make a good point there about archives and sources. You mentioned that there's a difficulty in learning about some of these women's stories during World War II. Why do we have that difficulty?
I guess it's really the interest in them after the war. So we do have the personnel files in the National Archives, just like we have for F section. So it depends what of that survives and what there was even in the first place, to be brutally honest. And you get a confusion as well with code names or cover names, because some of the files are in their cover names as well. And you're like, these could be two different people if I didn't know they were the same person. So that gets a bit convoluted. And they're very factual. It's very difficult to build up a picture of somebody's personality from these files, especially because they're mostly male instructors, some of whom, let's be honest, they were just sexist, or they didn't. Some of them said we just didn't want women to go, so we said negative things because we just didn't want them to go, and then to hear what had happened to them. So there is that difficulty. What I was so fortunate with this time was I received funding from the Jerry Holdsworth Special Forces Charitable Trust, who I have to say a massive thank you to, because that enabled me to travel. So I went to archives abroad and photographed everything. I had no idea if it was any good or not. I don't speak Danish, I don't speak Polish. I had a Lena next to me in Poland actually, and she was like, yeah, that's good, that's not. But yeah, you just photograph everything and then get it translated later. So that's the difference with Mission Europe. I was able to go to the countries and to get my hands on these archives.
I think you also raise, a really interesting point there about the some of these men's attitudes towards the women, not wanting them to be there because they didn't want to hear what was going on afterwards, and not letting them in because those sexist attitudes. But when
Mm.
these women are serving alongside the men, we know Elżbieta Zawadzka. was instructing men what to do, and
Mm.
what was their attitude to working with, alongside, and for these women?
If you look at the personnel files as the source, it's usually fairly negative and fairly derogatory. But once they're out in the field, you tend to get very positive reports. If they're not positive, you can quite often find out why. So she's not in this book, but Anne Marie Walters, for example, she wrote a brilliant book called Moondrop to Gascony, and it just ends and says, "And I left France." End of. There was a massive argument between her and her circuit leader. She caught him torturing somebody he shouldn't have been torturing, and the whole thing got really nasty. So you can find out if there are negative reports. You tend to be able to find out why, or if there were conflicts of personality. Lise de Bézac and Tony Brooks hated one another, for example, and you find that in the reports quite quickly. But they tended to be, we're all in this together. Male superiority. There might be in terms of weapons handling and stuff like that, but Jeanne Boeck in my French chapter, because I still include France, she was an explosives instructor, and the blokes thought she was brilliant. They loved her. She went round the villages teaching blokes how to blow things up, and had it not been for her, the rail sabotage around D-Day wouldn't have been as successful as it was, because she was teaching men how to blow stuff up. So there was this respect as well.
Then it's really interesting to hear how that kind of attitude changes from not being with them to actually working alongside them and being metaphorically in the trenches together.
Yeah.
But then, a crucial part of these operations and resistance is working alongside civilians or relying upon civilians for help. How do they, react to women taking on these roles?
The women are doing it anyway in these countries. So if you look at the Netherlands, there are women working on underground newspapers. They are producing false identity cards, which is one of the main parts of Dutch resistance, is this huge underground movement. And there are women doing this already. It feels to me very hand in hand. Men and women are just working hand in hand. There is no you're a woman and therefore, but there might be you're a woman and therefore could you put a false bottom in your pram please and carry all these newspapers. Or there's a maternity corset in the Dutch Resistance Museum where the bump is full of papers, and she's like, no one will check me because I'm pregnant, and it's just full of papers. So there's this, they're already doing it. So they're very happy to work alongside one another and to give responsibility to these women who are coming in, or certainly to be happy to work alongside them. The Netherlands is a complex one. I've sort of gone in there as if it's really easy. Obviously, we've got the whole debacle of the Englandspiel and 57 agents parachuting into their deaths, basically. I think 4 of them survive, one of which is Trix Terwint. But yeah, SOE is rebuilt on the back of that, and these women manage to do their jobs.
No, I find it incredible how yeah, I find it absolutely awesome how they're able to use natural advantages like, that the maternity corsets or
Mm.
hide something in a suitcase and cover them with clothes. It's really ingenious and inspiring reading about it. But then you mentioned, those some of those failed missions and some of those, sad losses. What happens to these agents when and if they're caught by the Nazi regimes or the occupying forces?
They are treated as spies, whether or not they're treated as spies. So just to return to Trix, you're not going to read the Dutch chapter after this, but to return to Trix, I mean, she's arrested on landing, as all the men who'd parachuted in before her. There was a message that came through on the wireless a few days before she parachuted in saying, "Welcome to our brave ladies." SOE believed that this was a message coming from other SOE agents. They didn't realize the wireless sets had been caught and were being operated by the Nazis. And she said, this is a bit, they know too much already. And SOE said, oh, I'll just go anyway, it's fine. She's arrested the minute she lands. She's held in various prisons. And then when the Englandspiel ends, the protection of the Abwehr officer also ends. So she's transported to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Then she goes to Mauthausen and she's liberated from Mauthausen. But it's just a brutal story. I've got some agents, my Hungarian agent, the Hungarian agent, she's not mine, she's everybody's, Hannah Sanesh. She crosses the border into Hungary and is immediately arrested because she's left her uniform back in Yugoslavia. They've swum across the river to get to Hungary. And she's caught with her wireless set. and they actually accuse her of being a spy against her own people because she's come from Yugoslavia. So although she is Hungarian, they accuse her of being a spy. She's absolutely brutalized and she's eventually executed as a spy.
I mean, it's so many times when you're reading, through the Nazi treatment of military prisoners, SOE agents, spies, and stuff. You do begin to just picture how brutal the Nazi regime is. Statistics never really do it justice. But then, you know, you're mentioning there's some light there, and that sometimes there is friendships built within those treatments. You know, could you just let us know about some of them?
Yeah, so Hannah Sonesh is with a load of other men from the Palmach, and they kind of manage to maintain this camaraderie even when they're in prison. They don't see one another, but they know what's happening to one another. So when I think it's Joel Palgi writes the testimony, he says, we heard a gunshot and then realized it was Hannah. And there is this backup almost, this support. Likewise, there's not Sarika Braverman, Haviva Reich is with colleagues and comrades right the way through her capture, the incarceration, and then it's not even an execution for them, it's a massacre. It's horrific. But you find these bonds of friendship growing up within the concentration camp systems. And I was so delighted to discover, so I've been studying the Ravensbrück stories for decades. And there's always been this thing, 4 women were hanged. And I was like, oh, there must be some confusion here, because aren't we talking about Szabo and Rolf and Bloch being shot? But there's always comes back to this testimony of these 4 women being hanged. And I just thought it was a mistake. It's not. There were 4 French women who were SOE agents who were hanged the week before or some weeks before the F section agents were executed. And I could link it back to an affidavit from Yvonne Baisden, who was F section, who was in Ravensbrück. And these women become friends. And Yvonne's in the hospital, and Eugenie Degendi, I think you pronounce it, was friends with her. And she would just come into the hospital and she would chat and she'd say, I've been to see Fritz Surin today and I've asked for better conditions because we shouldn't be treated like this because we're members of the French Foreign Service after all. And she comes back and she makes all these reports to Yvonne. And then Yvonne finally never hears from them again, and that bond of friendship is ripped from Yvonne. But through her affidavits, we're able to find out about these 4 women who I don't believe have ever been discussed with relation to SOE in Ravensbrück.
It's again, it goes back to that point of you don't quite realize the brutality and the experiences that these people went through until you hear these stories and
No.
you have their anecdotes.
There's the anecdote from Trix where she says, I tried to put my hands down by my side, but my arms didn't fit anymore because my rib cage was sticking out so badly. And that just finished me when I read that. And then there's an account from Brigitte Friang, who was shot. And then instead of going for care, they used the gunshot wound against her for torture. And apparently the medical staff just walks out and left to the Gestapo. And you just think, oh my God, how did she come through that? How did she survive it? And she goes on to parachute into Vietnam as well.
So I think that leaves a question there. For the women who survived, what did they go on and do afterwards? So where did they go? Did they continue to serve? Did they, just leave the forces altogether?
Quite hard to find out for a lot of them, because if they did go over to MI6, we don't know about it because the MI6 files are shut. I'd like to think some of them do. Somebody like Trix, she ends up actually having pioneering LSD treatment after the war to try and help her get over her nightmares. She also wants to get the guard who was looking after her in prison, exonerated. She thinks he should be, everything's all right. She goes back to her work. She was a KLM stewardess, and damn it, she'd worked hard to get there before the war. She was going back the minute she could. I'm trying to think of some others. Brigitte Friang becomes a journalist. Like I say, she parachuted, it's either Vietnam or Indochina, but she becomes a war correspondent and parachutes again. And then I'm just trying to think of some other ones to tell you their stories. About Elaine Madden, directly after her SOE mission finishes, she goes to work for an organization that are trying to help liberate the concentration camps. They want people with parachute training. So she goes to work for them. After the war, she gets married. She has a child. The litany of tragedy, actually, for her. It's really, really sad. But a lot of them just went back to the world that they were fighting for in the first place. So going back to being wives, housewives, mothers, doing some work, but not necessarily groundbreaking work. And I've always said this, I don't think they did this to shatter glass ceilings. They did it because it needed to be done, not to prove that women could do it.
I really like that point. That they're doing it because it needed to be done. You can see that in a lot of the way that these women who are running resistance units, working within resistance units, they're doing it to protect their family, their parents, but also it's really interesting how those skills that they develop as the SOE are transferred across into their,
Yeah.
their their jobs afterwards. But then, when we talk about families and doing something that needs to be done, how did their family, you know, react if they know that they're serving in this capacity?
I've got very few anecdotes about that in this particular book, but I know Jan Boeck, my explosive skill, she basically escapes from France in the Battle of France, the Fall of France. She gets out and she doesn't tell her parents where she's going. And she comes back because she wants her bicycle. So when she comes back as an SOE agent for the RF section, which is de Gaulle's section, she goes home and goes to visit her parents. And they say, "Thank God you're back. Fantastic, settle down." And she says, "No, no, 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 no. Just come to get my bike. There's a war to be won. I'll be back when the war's over." And there's another agent in France who didn't want her parents to be implicated in what she was doing. So she ends up moving out of the family home so that she can go and do her work without getting them involved. So I think people were very conscious about separating their work from their family life, because if the Gestapo got you, they would get your family. And that's the horrible story with Hannah Sanesh, is that she had emigrated to Palestine. And of course, once she joined the Palmach, the secret fighting organization, she couldn't tell her mother that she was going back to Hungary. In fact, her brother arrived just before she was about to go back into Europe, and she couldn't even tell him. She just said, I'm going away for work, basically. So George is in Palestine, and Catherine, the mother, is really happy that her kids are together. They're in Palestine, they're safe. They're Jewish and they're safe. And then the next thing Catherine Sanesh knows is she's taken to a prison, and they say, "Where's your daughter?" And she says she's in Palestine. She's working on a kibbutz. And they say, "She's in the room next door." And then they take her in, and Hannah has been brutalized. And Catherine is put in front of her daughter. I'm amazed they didn't talk to Catherine in front of Hannah as well, but they didn't. But they kept the two in prison together to try and work against each other. It's horrible. So yeah, there are real family links to all of this. You really could get dragged into it.
Definitely, I definitely felt when I was reading Hannah's story there and her going into prison and her mother being next to her, I just thought that was absolutely horrific
Awful, isn't
for
it?
both of them. But then, Kate, I've got a final fun question for you, as we do for all our guests here on the podcast. You've included so many inspiring and quite frankly awesome women, SOE agents in this new book, Mission Europe. And I know this is a tough question now, but did you have a favorite when you were researching and writing, or did it change?
It does change. It does change because you get really drawn into what you're looking at the moment. And the way this book was written, in contrast to Mission France, is it is by country. So it was quite complete. So I was like, right, I finished that country. I'm going to go to this one. Edith Bonessen in Denmark. Oh, she's amazing. She's just amazing. And I remember us in Copenhagen, and I was like 2 hours before I had to go to the airport, and I got an email from the National Archives saying her file's here. And it's like, go, 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 photograph everything. She's brilliant. So she was a wireless operator, an incredibly talented wireless operator. I can't state that enough. She was what the Danish did for wireless communications during the Second World War is unbelievable. The technology was phenomenal. Anyway, Edith was a wireless operator. She trained people to be wireless operators, etc., etc. But one day she was in a warehouse with her circuit leader, if you will, and they get a phone call and somebody asks for them by their real names, not their code names. And she puts the phone down and she says, "We're done for." Next minute, the Gestapo were in there. They bundle her into a car and drive her through Copenhagen to the Shell House, which is Gestapo headquarters. And she is seen by one of the resistance/SOE agents in the car. So they know she's been arrested. And then they've been trying to catch her for ages. So they plonk her on a bench, and then all the Gestapo officers naff off and crack the wine, and they get really drunk. And she's sitting there thinking, this is going to go one of two ways. This is either going to be horrific for me, or it's going to work in my favor. And they get pickled and they kind of forget about her. So she gets up and she sees two other men walking around Gestapo headquarters, looking like they're heading for the door. So she just joins them and walks out and walks down the street. And then she says, "I took off my white turban because I didn't want anyone to recognize my turban." And then she walks back to her base. And they're like, "We thought you were arrested." And she said, "I didn't like the smell of the bakery," was how she phrased it. Gosh, she's hard as nails. She's brilliant. I won't ruin the rest of the story because it goes a little bit wrong and then goes right again. I just found her fascinating, and I would dearly love to do more work on her.
I would love to read more on her because that was such. I don't want to give it away either. It's such an awesome story.
It's amazing, though, isn't it?
Loved reading that part. Now, obviously, we've just teased that there's even more in here. I particularly love the Dutch section. Don't know why.
Hmm.
But then, where can people go and grab a copy of Mission Europe, Kate?
So your independent bookshops really need you at the moment. I would say any independent bookshop. I'm particularly fond myself of Fox Lane or Warwick Books or your local independent, or you can get it directly through the Yale University Press website as well. Failing that, you know where to go, but try to go to your indies. They love it. And we love it because we get to go
Oh,
and support them as well.
well, I'll leave a link in the description below for your book so people can go and grab it from an independent
Fab.
bookseller. And then where can people go to keep up to date with you?
You can follow me on X. I'm afraid I'm still there at historical_Kate. I'm on Instagram, Dr. Kate Vigurs. Where else? I'm about to start Substack, so watch out for that. I've been given my homework and I've got my website where I'm going to try and keep people up to date of where I'll be speaking, because there's lots of exciting speaking engagements this year as well.
The Chalke History Festival special series on history with Jackson.